The sun was setting over the lake when I first heard the heavy knock on the cabin door. I had been sipping coffee by the window, watching the ripples of the water and enjoying the silence of the woods. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the old wooden frame of the door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, hands on their belts and stern looks on their faces. "We received a call from the Homeowners Association," one of them said. "There have been complaints about unauthorized use of this property." I almost laughed out loud because I knew exactly who had made that call. HOA Karen. She had been circling my cabin all week, snooping over the fence, muttering about how people like me should not own lake property. Now she had escalated to the police, thinking she could scare me away. Before I could answer, another voice echoed from inside the cabin, calm and steady. "Gentlemen, why don't you come inside for a moment?" The officers froze mid-step, their expressions shifting from authority to uncertainty as the figure appeared in the doorway behind me. It was Michael, the district attorney. He was sitting in my living room reviewing files spread across the coffee table when the cops interrupted our quiet evening. The officers glanced at each other, their tones suddenly cautious. "District Attorney Harris, we did not realize you were here." Michael adjusted his glasses and spoke evenly. "I imagine you were sent here by a woman from the Homeowners Association." The officers nodded, and one said she insisted this was trespassing property, that the owner was absent. Michael leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You are standing in a legally owned cabin registered under this man's name, and I am here as a guest reviewing active cases with him." The room went silent except for the creak of the wooden floor. Outside, I could see Karen standing near the road, her arms crossed, smugness plastered across her face, as she waited for what she thought would be my humiliation. But when the cop stepped back and their tones softened, her smile faltered. "Sir," one of the officers said, "we apologize for the intrusion. It seems we were misled." Michael stood up, his presence commanding the entire room. He walked to the doorway, where the evening light hit his face sharp and clear. "I think it is time we had a conversation with this association president of yours," he said. The officers hesitated, glancing back toward Karen, who was now pretending to scroll on her phone, as if she had not orchestrated this whole fiasco. Michael stepped onto the porch, his shoes crunching on the gravel, his eyes fixed on her. Karen's confidence began to crumble, her arms shifted nervously, and her forced smile wavered as the district attorney approached, flanked by 2 officers who were no longer on her side. I followed behind him, quietly watching the power shift in real time. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but her words stumbled over themselves. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Michael raised an eyebrow, his voice cool and firm. "A misunderstanding is when you get the wrong address. This, however, looks very much like harassment." The officers nodded slowly, as if agreeing with every word he said. Karen's face paled, the smugness gone, replaced with a flicker of fear as neighbors began peeking out their windows, drawn by the flashing lights of the patrol car. The silence that followed was heavier than the lake air around us. Karen shifted again, clearly searching for a way out, but there was none now, not with the district attorney standing in front of her and the entire neighborhood watching from behind their curtains. Karen's voice cracked as she tried again. "I was only following the rules. This man does not belong here." Michael's tone sharpened. "What rule exactly allows you to call the police on the legal owner of his property?" Karen blinked, her lips parting with no answer, her fingers nervously tugging at her sweater sleeve. The officers stood still, waiting, their hands resting by their belts, but their eyes never leaving Karen. Michael continued, his words steady like stone. "You wasted public resources, misled officers, and attempted to intimidate a private citizen, all because you did not like the idea of him owning this cabin." The neighbors who had been watching now whispered among themselves, the sound carrying faintly in the cool evening air. Karen glanced around, realizing the crowd was no longer with her self-appointed authority unraveling. I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. "Karen, you have been at my fence, at my driveway, and now at my door. It ends tonight." Her eyes flickered between me and Michael, then to the officers who no longer looked interested in protecting her. One officer finally spoke, his tone professional but edged with impatience. "Ma'am, if you cannot provide any evidence of wrongdoing, we will have to mark this as a false report." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Michael crossed his arms and said, "I think this neighborhood deserves better leadership than someone who abuses power to settle personal grudges." The whispers among the neighbors grew louder, some even nodding from their porches. Karen's face flushed deep red, and she muttered something under her breath before turning away, but the weight of every eye on her made her stumble on the gravel. I stood there watching as the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood with unchecked arrogance now looked small, fragile, and desperate under the fading light. Michael placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low enough only I could hear. This is far from over, but tonight the message is clear. You are not alone in this. The officers began taking notes, their pens scratching quietly against the report forms while Karen retreated slowly toward her house, her shoulders hunched as if the air itself had grown heavy around her. The lake was still behind us, calm and steady, its reflection of the twilight sky undisturbed, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment to unfold. The neighbors slowly drifted back to their porches, but the murmurs lingered like ripples across the lake. Karen walked faster, now her steps uneven, her voice carried faintly, "I will not forget this." Michael watched her go, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at me with calm certainty. "She has built her power on fear. Once that is gone, she will have nothing." The officers closed their notebooks. One of them gave me a nod, almost respectful, before saying, "If she calls again, without cause, she will be charged for misuse of emergency services." Karen stopped mid-step when she heard that, but she did not turn around. She only kept walking, her shoulders tighter, her back stiff. I stood in the fading glow of the cabin porch light, the air cool against my skin, and felt a quiet strength rising in me, a strength that came not from anger, but from knowing the truth was finally seen. Michael stepped toward the lake, his reflection stretching across the still water. Then he turned, his voice low and steady. "This cabin will no longer be a place of conflict. It will be where peace is restored." The neighbors who had lingered closest to the fence nodded one by one. The silent approval carried more weight than any shouted argument. Karen's front door slammed shut across the street, and with that the night finally seemed to exhale. The stars began to appear above the treetops, clear, sharp, and endless, as though they too were witnesses to what had unfolded on this quiet shore. Michael stayed quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the lake, as though he were measuring its calm against the storm that had just passed. I leaned against the porch rail, the old wood creaking under my weight, and felt the tension in my chest slowly loosen. The officers drove away, their headlights fading into the trees, leaving behind only the hum of crickets and the gentle slap of water against the dock. A lantern glowed faintly from the neighbor's porch across the way, their shadows moving slowly inside, a quiet gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. Michael finally spoke, his voice carrying steady through the night. "She will try again, but this time she knows the law is not her weapon anymore." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside me. Karen had always relied on bluster and intimidation, but tonight she had faced something different, something she could not bend or twist to her advantage. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe without the heaviness of her shadow pressing down. Michael walked back to the porch, his footsteps even and sure, and sat beside me, his presence a silent reminder that I was not alone in this fight. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called out, its haunting song rising and falling like a voice of reassurance, and I felt the night wrap around me, not as a warning, but as a promise of quiet strength yet to come. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the lake, turning the water into a sheet of gold. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, and the stillness felt different, lighter, calmer, as if the cabin itself had exhaled overnight. Michael was already on the porch, papers spread across the table. His sharp eyes moved quickly as he reviewed files, each page another shield against the chaos Karen tried to unleash. He looked up when he noticed me and offered a small smile, one that said he had not forgotten the seriousness of last night, but also that there was hope now. Across the dirt road, Karen's car sat crooked in her driveway, curtains drawn tight. For the first time in weeks, she did not storm outside to watch me or shout across the way. Instead, her silence was louder than any of her insults had ever been. Michael closed the folder and tapped it gently on the table, as though setting an invisible line in place. "She is cornered now," he said, "but people like her do not fade quietly. They strike again when they feel power slipping through their fingers." His words lingered in the morning air, and I felt the truth of them settle deep. Karen was not finished, and the storm was not over, but now she knew this was not a battle she could fight alone. She had woken something far bigger than her own false authority, and the lake that once felt like her stage now held eyes and ears beyond her reach. The breeze picked up, stirring the trees and carrying with it the scent of pine and damp wood. Michael gathered his papers neatly and leaned back in the chair, his gaze fixed not on Karen's house, but on the lake horizon. "This place is more than land," he said quietly, and his words felt like a vow, a reminder that what was mine would not be taken so easily. That afternoon, the quiet of the lake was broken by the sound of Karen's voice drifting through the trees. She was on her phone, pacing wildly in her driveway, her words sharp and heated, though I could not catch every one. But the desperation in her tone was clear. Michael stepped onto the porch beside me, his arms crossed as he listened. "She is scrambling," he said softly, reaching out for anyone who will still listen, "but soon she will learn no one can undo what was already set in motion." Karen slammed her car door and drove off, gravel spitting behind her tires, the noise echoing through the calm woods. The lake settled back into silence. Once, she was gone, almost as if it had rejected her presence entirely. Michael glanced at me, then at the papers on the table. "We will not go looking for her," he said. "She will come back on her own, and when she does, she will find the rules have changed." I sipped the last of my coffee, the warmth grounding me as I looked across the water. For the first time, I did not feel the usual knot of worry in my stomach when Karen's name came up. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that her power was slipping no matter how tightly she tried to hold it. The sun dipped lower and painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Michael leaned back in his chair, and the cabin seemed to breathe with him, its walls strong and steady, like an old ally that had seen storms come and go. The lake shimmered calm and patient, as though it knew this was only the beginning of something larger, something Karen could no longer control. As night settled over the lake, the hum of crickets filled the air, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I sat on the porch, lantern glowing beside me, while Michael remained steady and unreadable, a stack of folders resting at his side. Far across the water, headlights appeared, weaving slowly down the road toward the cabins. It was Karen's car again, moving slower this time, like a predator circling its prey. But when she pulled into her driveway, she did not storm out or shout. Instead, she sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, as though the weight of the night pressed too heavy on her shoulders. Michael's eyes flicked toward the car, then back to the lake. "She is calculating," he murmured, "and that can be dangerous, but desperation is easy to spot." The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft croak of frogs near the shore. Finally, Karen's door creaked open. She stepped out, phone clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes darting toward our cabin like a challenge left unspoken. Then she turned sharply and slammed her door, disappearing inside with the porch light flicking on in defiance. Michael exhaled a low breath and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "She wants us to see her. She wants us to know she is not done yet," he said, "but she forgets the law does not bend for her temper." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in my chest. The lake stretched before us, vast and calm, holding its secrets in silence, while the two houses sat like rival sentries on its edge. And though the night wrapped itself around us thick and quiet, I could sense a storm building again, just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. The next morning, a thin mist hung over the lake, blurring the line between water and sky. The air was cool, damp, with the smell of pine and earth, as if the world was holding its breath. Michael was already awake when I stepped outside. He stood at the edge of the porch, phone in hand, speaking in that calm, measured tone that carried authority without needing volume. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Karen's curtains twitched across the road, a faint movement, but enough to show she was watching. Her house looked smaller in the morning light, fragile, even though she carried herself with so much noise and fury. She stepped outside finally, her jaw tight, her phone clutched like a weapon as she marched to her car. Michael watched her without a word, his gaze steady, his silence sharper than anything he could have said. She started her engine, the sound breaking the quiet morning, and sped away down the dirt road, kicking up gravel and dust that lingered long after she was gone. Michael turned back to me, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint, knowing smile. "She is running out of ground," he said. "Her power came from fear, and now fear is leaving her." The lake lapped gently against the dock, the steady rhythm grounding me more than any words could. I sat on the porch steps watching the mist slowly lift as the sun began to warm the water. Michael pulled a chair beside me, his presence a constant reminder that Karen's chaos was only temporary. The trees stood tall around us, the cabin solid at my back, and the lake endless before me. And though Karen's shadow still lingered, I could feel it thinning with every hour that passed. By midday the mist had burned away, leaving the lake clear and sparkling under the bright sun. Birds darted through the trees, their calls sharp and cheerful as if the forest itself was reclaiming its calm. Michael sat at the porch table again, files spread neatly before him, his pen moving across a page with practiced precision. He barely looked up as he spoke. Her calls to the county are being logged, every complaint, every false report, it will all be part of the record. I leaned against the railing, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath my palms. Across the road, Karen's driveway sat empty, her car gone, her house quiet like a stage between acts. But even in her absence, the weight of her presence hung in the air, a tension that refused to fade completely. Michael finally looked up, his eyes steady and sharp. "She thinks silence is power," he said, "but silence only gives us room to prepare." The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water and carrying the faint scent of pine deeper into the air. For the first time in weeks, I felt the rhythm of the lake return, steady and natural, like a heartbeat that had been disrupted but was finding its way back. Michael closed the file in front of him and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "She is not done," he said quietly, "but neither are we." The sunlight shifted through the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. And as I sat there beside him, I knew the cabin would hold steady through whatever storm Karen tried to summon next. That evening the lake glowed orange with the last light of the setting sun. The water rippled gently as if nothing had ever disturbed it, and for the first time in a long while peace felt real again. Karen returned just as the sky turned purple, her car rolling into the driveway with none of its usual noise. She stepped out slowly, shoulders heavy, eyes downcast, no shouts, no phone in her hand, no binder of rules. For once she looked small against the towering pines. Michael watched her from the porch, calm and steady, his silence louder than any challenge. Karen glanced toward us, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Then she turned away and disappeared into her house, her porch light flicking on like a final surrender. The night wrapped around the cabin with its familiar sounds of crickets and the soft splash of fish in the water. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the stars scattered across the sky like a promise of quiet days ahead. Michael closed his folder for the last time and set it aside, his voice low but certain. "It is over now." I nodded, the tension in my chest loosening as I looked out across the calm lake. The cabin stood strong, the trees tall, the water endless. And in that stillness, I knew Karen's reign of chaos had ended, not with a battle but with silence. The lake was ours again, and peace had finally come home.